The J word's on a lot of people's minds, and there's some people who've heard all they want to hear. But how do we lament with our community? Jim's going to read something that a pastor from Queens, New York says.
You see, God is not simply in the business of dry cleaning our souls. He is in the business of tearing down walls and creating a new family, a new way of belonging together. One could argue that the primary fruit of the gospel is not going to heaven when you die, but rather the miraculous new family that is created out of the death and the resurrection of Jesus. Racial justice and reconciliation remain two of the most urgent matters of faith and public witness. In this respect, the cross of Christ isn't just a bridge that gets us to God. It's a sledgehammer that breaks down walls that separate us. In the midst of all the confusion and anger that persist due to racial tensions in our country and world, the church must lead the way in proclaiming a message of hope, justice, and reconciliation.
So Charmaine, tell us a little bit about your story. and certainly the work that you do that's so fascinating to me.
Thanks, Phil, for giving me the opportunity to do this. So in terms of my personal story, I was born in Jamaica and came here for college and went to Howard University in Washington, D.C., and came right after high school. So I've been here for most of my life. And when I went to Howard, I left Jamaica planning to become a physician. That was the plan. That was my plan. But God had other plans, and I ended up graduating undergrad. And before I graduated, my senior year, I did a course in genetics and had never done genetics before, and I was fascinated by that science and wanted to do more in that, and decided, we're not going to go to medical school, we're going to go to graduate school and do genetics, and did my master's and doctorate in human genetics, and then became faculty at Howard, teaching genetics and bioethics. So the program that I was in at Howard, and genetics, study of DNA and all that fascinating science, has God all over it. And my program, the directors of my program were also, they were geneticists and they were bioethicists. And they infused bioethics, what ought we to do, and with this science. So my work in genetics, it was just intertwined with my work in ethics and bioethics and equity and justice. And that's how I learned genetics. They're not separate for me. And so when I finished my doctorate and I was going to do a postdoc, and kind of wondered, okay, I knew then that I did not want to work in a lab, which is what most geneticists do. At that, you graduate with your PhD, you go work in a lab. But Charmaine didn't want to do that. That was not my work. I wanted to work on the ethical issues in genetics, ethical and social issues. And God just put the right people in my path. Yeah. The directors of the program just opened doors for me, doors that I would not even have imagined. And the director of the program referred me to someone at NIH, the National Institutes of Health, based on what I said I wanted to do. And I went and talked with her, and I told her what I wanted to do, and she said, I've been looking for you my whole life. Oh, wow. And she hired me on the spot as her first postdoc. And that experience at NIH just opened just a world for me in terms of being able to interact with movers and shakers in the field of human genetics. And fast forward, I went back to Howard, became faculty there, taught there for 10 years. And coming to Howard from Jamaica, coming to the US from Jamaica, but particularly going to Howard University, I learned about race at Howard and racism, which was quite different from my experience growing up in Jamaica. I mean, we knew when we heard about race, but it was just a different environment and different society. And as I learned more about racism and the idea of race and how it was created and how the role that we, society, had to play in doing that, and the role that science, genetics in particular, plays in creating that idea of difference among human groups, that over time became my work, but it's my calling. And I don't talk about what I do as my work. I'm a professor at Duke, and I teach genetics, I teach bioethics. I do work related to race and racism. And every day I get up and I go, and it is with that in mind, it's the calling. And as we talk about the church, and so science and its role in genetics and creating the idea, but science came later than the church, right? And the role that Christianity played in these ideas, the curse of Ham, and this thinking that Noah cursed Ham, he didn't curse Ham, he cursed Canaan, his son. And it wasn't God who did the cursing, it was Noah, right? But this idea from some in the Christian faith that Ham is cursed, and Ham is the ancestor of Black people, African people, and that provided justification for the enslavement, and we find justifications for anything we want to do, and the Scripture, misrepresented and misinterpreted as it is, provided that justification, helped to provide that justification for the dehumanization of people of African descent. And when I say of African descent, we're all of African descent, right? Because our science tells us that we all came out of Africa. And depending on where we went, we developed different skin tones and different physical features in terms of our interactions with the environment. So we're connected. We're one people, regardless of what we look like. And when I teach students about how we came to have the skin color we have and the features we have, and how much more alike we are than we are different, they're amazed. Genetics tells us that we're 99.9% the same at the DNA level, regardless of what we look like. And that's my message. It's helping people appreciate our common humanity, as well as our differences, right? Because God called us to oneness. He didn't call us to sameness. And so we need the variation. It's part of his plan. But with regard to the lament, for me, it's for the church and for us to recognize, to reckon with our past, not just our complicity. We're complicit in racism, but we had an active role to play in it as well. And so to reckon with that, but also to recognize the responsibility and the opportunity that we have to help address racism in our societies.
You don't seem at all angry.
Not at all. Having the approach that I have, which is one of healing for all of us, because what many people don't realize is that racism does not negatively affect only the people who are oppressed, but the oppressors are negatively affected as well. And I choose to take an approach of bringing people together. And one of the centers I direct at Duke is called the Center for Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. And what I find interesting about that center, it's a national movement, Truth Racial, the TRHT movement. And I applied for a grant to start the center, and they were giving out grants. And I know when I first heard about it, truth, racial healing, and transformation, I thought, those are Bible words. Those are scriptural words. And that center is another one of God's miracles, just in how he brought it together. And it's a center at Duke, and we do these racial healing circles to bring people together. Very powerful methodology. And so for me, we have to draw people in with love.
Yeah.
And it's my faith that gives me the approach. And the Lord called us to love one another, love Him first, and to love everybody.
You seem very hopeful.
I am. I have to be. I think, racism is a terrible thing, and it seems like we just are never going to be able to fix it. But I think one step at a time, one person at a time. And when I talk with students whose perspectives, and I teach them about what race is, what it's not, and their eyes are opened, people are changing their thoughts about this idea that we use to separate us.
Yeah.
And separation is a key tool of racism. If you can separate people, and segregation in the U.S. and other places, it's a tool that really makes racism happen. It makes it work. Because the more you can separate people, you keep them from interacting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then they will consistently think that they're so different. But once they come together, which is what the RX Racial Healing Circles do, is bringing people together, not to talk about race, but to talk about our shared humanity, to share stories about things that we have in common as human.
When Charmaine and I talked a few weeks ago, I did my best to shame myself for my racism because I was forthcoming about that. It's how I was raised to think. And but you wouldn't let me do that. I felt such grace and kindness.
Because we're fallible. We all are.
Yeah.
We all are. And none of us is exempt.
Yeah.
But God forgives, so we need.
So
we
were
need
you
to as well.
lamenting with me that day?
I probably was, Phil.
I felt like you were. And the other thing that struck me, some days I think about how patient God is. Mm-hmm. God's been waiting for some things to happen a very long time.
Mm-hmm. Yes, He has been.
And I see that character of God's in you. So I want to offer a thought, something that Eugene Peterson said. I'd like to get your response to it. Eugene said, a faith that doesn't serve justice can end up making us worse instead of better. It can actually separate us from God and God's ways instead of drawing us to Him. What do you think?
The Bible is just filled with references of doing justice, of caring for widows and orphans, and honest scales, and on and on and on. And if we fall short, or as we fall short in that regard that is so abundantly clear, then we are shaking a fist at God. If we're not addressing the justice issue, then we're not pleasing God. And if we're not pleasing Him, then we are distant from Him. He is slow to anger and abounding in love. But He's given us a chance to come around. But until we get the justice piece right, we're falling way short.
And He also gives us a number of examples of racial justice. The woman of Samaria. He didn't have to go that way. But he knew he had to meet her. The Good Samaritan. There's so many stories about caring for those who society says you don't mix, right? The Jews and the Gentiles. We have examples. So sometimes we have to get up out of our comfort zones to interact with the people that we wouldn't normally interact with.
Well, and I think if we're about sharing the gospel and helping people see the true love and hope of Christ. I mean, what better way is for the church to be a church that shows love to the oppressed?
Yeah.
Because the brokenness that's there when you're coming together, like Charmaine said, in love, I mean, that's what the gospel's about, right?
Yeah. I said a few minutes ago, God loves us as we are, not as we should be. But that doesn't mean He's going to let us remain that way. So we're wrapping up this conversation. This has been such a privilege to engage with you. What are you hearing? What do you want to take from this? You sense God kind of wooing you in a particular way? We've talked about lament that leads to praise. We've talked about having empathy, and lamenting with others, lamenting with ourselves. And now this idea of lamenting with our community, particularly around this matter of justice.
I'm hearing of, I guess, like church community, family. Yeah. That seems to be the big thing. That this whole conversation is, each one is people coming together, people like, it's just, that's what it feels like. It's like just community itself. This past couple of years, I feel like we've been very fractured, been very divided a lot. It's very disheartening, it's very sad. It's very awful to see, especially seeing like some of my friends go through some things this past couple of years. Some of my friends have even left the faith, and it's so sad to see. And that's my family and that's my community, and I feel like they're just like, it hurts. It hurts to see it. So in a way, community of just healing and just being with each other.
I think my invitation is just a reminder, like collectively for all of us, and then also for myself. The last few years have been tough, and I think we're hopefully coming more out of the pandemic now, but I think people have been in such a survival mode. I've been in a survival mode. And I think we're now in a place where we have a little bit more space to actually take stock of what's happened.
Yeah.
So I think this conversation has even invited me to say, you know, what do I need to go into in my own heart and acknowledge, but with God, trusting Him in that. Yeah. And then with other people in community and in the church, how do we become mindful of people? How do we look around and really see? Like I said, I think we wear masks sometimes. I think sometimes we can just get busy because life can be busy. But to really look around and to think about how to practice empathy, and how do we invite those times, like Charmaine said, of sharing stories and being with each other. The relationships, I think that's the invitation that I hear. So
It's all about story, isn't it?
It is, in building relationships.
Well, thank you for participating in this conversation. It's been a rich, rich gift.